Located at the southern tip of Roosevelt Island, this fine Gothic revival structure was originally constructed for the treatment of that loathsome malady, smallpox, and for many years was New York City's only such institution. It is now a picturesque ruin, one which could readily serve as the setting for a 19th century Gothic romance. From the 1976 Landmark Preservation Commission report on the Renwick Smallpox Hospital on Roosevelt Island, New York. Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jen.
So today I want to talk about the Renwick Smallpox Hospital, which is located on Roosevelt Island here in New York City. Right now, it is just a ruin. There's no hospital left. There's just some walls standing on the southern part of the island. And you and I saw it last year.
It was the one behind the fence, right?
Right. It's behind a chain link fence.
Yeah.
It's this creepy old Gothic building that is crumbling. And at night, it's lit up by these floodlights. So it looks super creepy. And this isn't really a paranormal topic. However, I really want, once all of this coronavirus stuff has died down some, to do a paranormal investigation there. I would love to do an Estes session there. I really want to talk to the spirits of the doctors, nurses, and patients who were kind of like, not our forebears in infectious disease anxiety, but like I'm super curious to see if we can communicate with ghosts who might have some wisdom for us in this. And also a reason why I wanted to talk about it today, aside from being interested in it, because I want to do that investigation sometime in the near future, because of our quarantine situation, probably every other day I go to the water in Queens and look out at Roosevelt Island, because there's not much else to do these days except go for a walk. And since we live in Astoria, that's a convenient place to walk. So I've now found myself staring at Roosevelt Island for long amounts of time, at least every other night, sometimes every night. Sometimes, like last night, I'll look at the ducks for a while.
This is what cabin fever does.
Exactly. And then I talk to the ducks, and then the ducks run away. I've been talking to birds a lot lately.
This is very on brand for you.
Every time they glare at me and run away.
Sounds about right.
So, in this like lonely quarantine world, I have gotten even more interested than I already was in Roosevelt Island. And what I see when I go to the waterfront, I can't see the Smallpox Hospital from the part of Astoria that we live in, but we can see the Octagon, which is the old kind of foyer or entryway to the old New York Lunatic Asylum, which is pretty famous. There's a lot of accounts of that place because it was pretty like horrific. It's the place that Nellie Bly, who was like this reporter in the 19th century, got herself committed to, so that way she could report on conditions there.
Oh, wow.
So, and also I can see there is a lighthouse on the north end of the island, and so I can see the lighthouse. So there aren't that many structures left from the 19th century on the island, but I look at those two and I just keep trying to picture what it was like in the 19th century when it was mostly just hospitals and a prison and a workhouse and an almshouse on this island. But I guess for people who don't live in New York City, Roosevelt is an island in the East River. It's about equidistant between Manhattan and Queens. For anyone who's seen the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie...
I was just going to say that. That was my first reference to it when, like, I had no idea about Roosevelt Island, but when I came here and I saw that, Spider-Man, for sure.
Yep, me too. I think the first time I ever went to Roosevelt Island was, like, when I came to New York as a tourist in 2007, maybe. And, yeah, immediately I was like, oh, it's Spider-Man.
Yeah.
That tram, and I guess it's near the end of the movie, where he saves all the people in the tram.
Yeah. And MJ was like hanging from it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the tram that goes from Manhattan to Roosevelt Island. So I think that's the reference that most people would have for it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most kind of creepy and interesting thing on the island is the old ruined Smallpox Hospital, which is now, like we were talking about, just an empty shell, and it's just these creepy ruins. And so since it's a smallpox hospital, I realized as I started researching it that I don't really know that much about smallpox. And since we're all very anxious about coronavirus stuff, I don't actually want to talk about the specific symptoms of smallpox or how terrible and horrific it was. But I do want to talk about the societal impact and how it was spread and kind of the history of vaccination and inoculation with smallpox, because it's kind of interesting and it's like really relevant to why in the 19th century they built a smallpox hospital in an island in the middle of the East River. Do you know much about smallpox?
Not really. I mean, I always get it like associated with chickenpox, but I know they're very different.
I think they're like not as different as they might be.
But smallpox is like deadlier, right?
Yeah. Although there have been some cases, like depending on your immunity, if you're someone who's never been exposed, I think, to chickenpox, it could be very dangerous.
Yeah.
I think it used to be more dangerous than it is now. But, we're all vaccinated against chickenpox. And actually, people aren't vaccinated against smallpox anymore because smallpox was basically wiped off the face of the planet. And the last case was in 1973.
Oh, wow.
So it's a case of a disease successfully being kind of vanquished by vaccination. But when it was a thing, it was pretty scary. It was really infectious. It was spread by airborne inhalation of the virus, so from droplets from infected people. So usually it was spread by face-to-face contact with someone. So it didn't spread as fast as it might have because you kind of had to be interacting with someone for a decent amount of time. And there was no such thing as a asymptomatic carrier of smallpox.
Oh.
If you were infectious, you had the rash. And if you didn't have the rash, you were not infectious.
Okay.
So kind of different from coronavirus, although, of course, the face-to-face contact thing is somewhat similar. Interestingly, the first smallpox inoculations were used in India, China, and Africa. There are some ancient texts in Sanskrit that describe the inoculation, and there are records of it being used in 10th century China, and by the Ming Dynasty in China, which was the 16th century, the inoculation was in common use. So basically what the inoculation was it introduced a less deadly strain of the virus into the patient, and the idea was that the patient would get immunity from that. However, about 1 in 5 people got full-blown smallpox and died or spread it to others.
Wow.
So it, of course, was helpful in a lot of ways, but also it was still very dangerous. So by the 1700s, people in Europe and America started using the inoculation. I think in America, most people's frame of reference to smallpox is pretty disturbing and has to do with genocide. Do you know about the history of smallpox in America?
No, I had no idea there was a connection to genocide.
Yeah, I really think in the U.S., at least among people our age, smallpox, the first thing you would think of is genocide because the English used smallpox as a biological warfare weapon during their genocide of the indigenous people of what's now the U.S. And it's confirmed that leadership, people high up in the British military, condoned and approved of the practice. And it will make your blood boil. It's awful to read some of the accounts of that. And it's just obviously completely evil. And so it's kind of interesting, I think, in the States, that's what most people our age think of when they think of smallpox. Mm-hmm. They think of smallpox blankets being given to the indigenous people of the U.S.
Smallpox blankets?
The US. Yeah, blankets infected with smallpox. And it was a engineered campaign of biological warfare.
Jesus.
With the intent to commit genocide. One thing that I was reading about that I hadn't heard is that apparently the British maybe did something similar in Australia, in New South Wales.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing probably happened in Australia.
Yeah. Some people have said that it actually wasn't smallpox, it was chickenpox.
Mm,
But either disease would have been equally deadly to the Aboriginal population.
yeah.
So it's evil and bad either way. So that happened kind of in the colonial era in the US, Australia. To go back to talking about vaccine stuff, in 1796, a English doctor figured out that people could be vaccinated more safely using cowpox. So a similar virus, but one that was less deadly for people. And that's actually where the word vaccine comes from. Vacca, or VACCA, is Latin for cow.
Oh.
So, and I probably butchered the Latin. I have no idea how you pronounce that, but that's where the word vaccine comes from. In the 19th century, a different strain of the virus started to be used. And over the years, as more and more people were vaccinated, smallpox was eradicated. The last case of smallpox, like I mentioned earlier, was in 1973. And nowadays, no one gets vaccinated. The only people who maybe might get vaccinated are like laboratory workers who might be exposed to smallpox if they're like doing research and might be exposed to it in their work. I found like one really interesting anecdote. So there's a lot of really famous people in history who've had smallpox. There's a king of Spain, emperor of Russia, king of France, prince elector of the Holy Roman Empire. Elizabeth I of England had smallpox. That's why she wore so much makeup, to cover up the pockmarks that were left by smallpox. There were American presidents who had smallpox, including George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
Joseph Stalin had smallpox. So obviously a lot of people died of smallpox, but a lot of people survived as well. And one really interesting anecdote that I found when I was reading was Catherine the Great of Russia. She did not get smallpox, but I believe her husband did. And he had a really severe case and suffered a lot from it. And I think had kind of some chronic health issues after that because of it. And she worried about her son getting smallpox so much that she actually socially isolated him and forbade him from being near large crowds.
Wow.
So that was pretty interesting. But eventually she found out about the vaccination and she and her son got the vaccination. And then she started a campaign to vaccinate as many people as possible that she could in the Russian Empire. So because of her efforts, 2 million people were vaccinated against smallpox.
Whoa, good for her.
I thought that was a really like cool and interesting story.
Yeah.
And I think that happened in the late 1700s. So that's a little bit about smallpox. So we talked about the inoculation and the vaccine, and that was a thing before the 19th century. So why did New York City build a smallpox hospital, a new smallpox hospital in the mid-19th century? Well, actually, cases of smallpox were on the rise in New York in the 1850s, even though the vaccine existed. And smallpox killed 25 to 30% of the people who got it. So, like, that's a little strange because the vaccine was available.
Yeah.
So why did people in 19th century New York City still have smallpox? One reason was because they didn't trust the government. They were sort of anti-vaxxers in a way. I guess the government was trying to get people to get vaccinated, but if the government couldn't provide clean water, at the time the streets were full of rotting animals. Like if horses died, they'd just leave them out in the street.
Ugh.
New York was disgusting at the time. The city government was extremely corrupt at the time. So it's not surprising that people didn't trust New York City. So in the 1850s, smallpox was on the rise. And kind of just an overview of the arc of smallpox in New York City after that. In the 1870s, there was another smallpox epidemic that killed 1,200 people.
Holy shit.
And then in 1900, it came back and killed 700 people. It took like a while for the health department to mobilize, but by 1902, the health department was vaccinating 10,000 New Yorkers every day. So they really eventually did mobilize and try to, help people protect themselves. And smallpox didn't return to New York until 1947, But that time the city acted really quickly. Within 2 weeks, 5 million people were vaccinated.
Whoa.
And that time, only 12 people got smallpox and only 2 people died.
Wow. That is such a huge difference.
It really shows how vaccination can save people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and right now with coronavirus and everything, we're all kind of waiting with bated breath for there to be a vaccine.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because now we're in like a world where there's anti-vaxxers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if people really studied history, they'd see those numbers are incredible.
Yeah.
You know, in less than 100 years, an epidemic that killed 1,200 people then only killed 2.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And in 1967, there was a movement to end smallpox for good, and it was successful. You know, 1973 was the last case of smallpox. So that's great. But in the 1850s, people were not necessarily vaccinated. Oh, and another thing about smallpox is you can get it more than once, and you can be vaccinated and still get it.
Oh.
So I read somewhere that they said the vaccine was only good for 30 years. I also read some accounts that said children, when vaccinated, would need to get vaccinated very frequently.
Wow.
And it sounds like the vaccine was somewhat unpleasant. Like, I think you got like kind of a rash around the injection site. It seems less pleasant than something like a flu shot. So I think that's another reason why it kind of hung out in New York for a while, before kind of there was a worldwide effort to end smallpox. And that's kind of why there had to be such a push to vaccinate everyone, especially if it had to be done more than once.
Yeah.
So a little bit of history about Roosevelt Island. In the 19th century, Roosevelt Island was called Blackwell's Island. It was named after the family who owned it up to that point. And in 1828, the city bought the island. We talked about how the island was in the East River. It's just south of an extremely dangerous part of the East River called Hellgate, which was actually the site of the greatest loss of life in New York City until 9/11.
Wow.
A ship caught fire and more than 1,000 people drowned. That's a story for another day, but I'm mentioning it because Hellgate is said to be very haunted, and I do want to talk about it another time. I do want to do some ghost investigations around there because that's near here.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have actually been there. Astoria Park is right at Hellgate.
Such a good name, Hellgate.
It is. Well, and when we went to Salem last month, we went over the Hellgate Bridge, which goes right over that spot where the ship sank. So it's a pretty creepy part of the East River, I would say. So Roosevelt Island is just south of there. So when the city bought it, it was pretty undeveloped. There was the house from the family who lived there. There was a wooded area on the east side of the island. There was a ton of fertile land for growing vegetable gardens. There was also a lot of stone on the island. So the island was made out of a blue stone, a type of stone called gneiss. Gneis. I looked it up, and for some reason, instead of being pronounced like niece, which is how I would say it, it's pronounced nice. And actually, it's a kind of stone called Fordham gneiss. So Fordham is my alma mater. It's in the Bronx. And this type of stone is called Fordham gneiss because though it's one of the 3 main types of stone that Manhattan's made from, in the Bronx, the stone is above the surface in a bunch of areas. And so the Bronx was home to Fordham Manor, which ended up becoming Fordham University. And this stone was used in a bunch of different buildings all over. Like, I know Fordham used the stone for a lot of buildings, but Blackwell's Island used the stone for building, I think, all of the buildings there. All the buildings that were built out of stone of Roosevelt Island, or Blackwell's Island, all the stone was quarried right there. So pretty convenient, since it's not like you have to bring building materials across the river.
Yeah. That would be hard. Especially back then.
It's really true. There's actually like so many interesting accounts of different ways that people got things to the island. Like at one point, much, much later in the mid 20th century, you know, there were a lot of hospitals on the island, and whenever they brought someone via ambulance to the island, because there wasn't a bridge to the island at the time, they had to drive the ambulance to the middle of the Queensboro Bridge, where there was an elevator they drove the ambulance into an elevator and brought it down to the island
Oh my
in a huge
God.
elevator.
That seems way too complicated for something as like for an emergency. Like,
yeah,
what?
it really does. I mean, I'm sure that's why they ended up building the bridge that connects Roosevelt Island and Queens now. There's also some really interesting accounts of the park that they built in 2012 that's on the south tip of the island, Four Freedoms Park. Getting the stone from that park to the island was like a ridiculous undertaking because it was marble, so it had to be brought from elsewhere.
Oh my God.
And they had to time things exactly perfectly with the tides, and like if one of the barges missed something by even like a few minutes, it sounded like they'd have to wait days for the barge to bring the granite over, and that was 2012.
Oh, Jesus. I thought
Yeah.
That's funny.
It's still challenging
Yeah.
to get things to and from the island now. Anything that's too heavy, that can't be taken on a bridge or, floated easily on a boat.
Wow.
So it's very convenient for them in the 19th century that they were able to build the buildings out of the stone on the island. So most of the buildings on the island were built from what they called rubble masonry, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a rough-hewn stone set in mortar. So it's kind of stones that are all different sizes stuck together versus a more neat type of stonework where it's stones that are all the same size, neatly in rows. So that also would have given all the buildings a much creepier look.
Yeah.
Kind of like that medieval castle look, just from being made from this, mortar or rubble masonry. So the first building that the city built on the island was the prison, or the penitentiary, which was built in 1832. All of the travel to and from the island went through the Department of Public Charities and Corrections. So that kind of tells you a lot about New York City at the time. There was one department for public charity, which includes things like charity hospitals, which we'll talk about later, different programs to help the poor. That was the same department as the Department of Corrections. And they controlled all movement on and off the island.
Wow.
So already pretty grim. The island was home to several kind of sanitarium, isolation style hospitals. There ended up being, an insane asylum. There's the penitentiary. There was a workhouse, and there was an almshouse. So a workhouse or an almshouse, they're both basically prisons for poor people where they're put to work.
Yeah.
So at the time, they made the distinction, at least in New York, that the workhouse was for criminals who needed hard labor to fix them. So it was people who'd committed small crimes like robbery or drunkenness. A lot of people, like the way it was described in a lot of contemporary newspapers, was that the workhouse was for people who were police prisoners, so people who cops arrested, and the prison was for people who had gone to court for bigger crimes like murder, that kind of thing. The almshouse was supposed to be gentler. It was for people basically whose crime was being poor. In theory, the almshouse is where older, sicker people were sent, and the workhouse was where more able-bodied people were sent. But anyone who was decently healthy in the almshouse still had to do labor. One article that I found from the 1850s talks about how one of the things that people in the workhouse did was kind of like the grading or landscaping of the island. They did tons of different jobs, though. And in 1850, the workhouse laborers were paid for their work. They made like between 50 and 35 cents per day. But a few years later, they abolished payment because the administrators thought that the workers would just spend all of the money on alcohol.
Ugh.
So they were essentially slave labor. And that features a lot in a lot of these stories,
Yeah.
Especially about how a lot of these buildings were built, Some things never change.
Mm-hmm.
So the people in the workhouse did more manual labor. The almshouse, some of the people from the almshouse were nurses or housekeepers at some of the other institutions in the island. Some of them baked. There was a bakery that supplied bread for all of the institutions on Blackwell's Island, and then all the institutions also on Randall's Island, which is a nearby island.
Yeah.
Some people were washers, ironers, carpenters, tailors, blacksmith, boatmen, cartmen, wool pickers. So in 1847, the almshouse housed 902 people. 760 of them were immigrants, 142 of them were born in the US. So both, the almshouse, the prison, it ended up being, I think, around 2/3 immigrant population, if not more, most of the time, which kind of tells you a lot about New York at the time.
Yeah.
Who was poor. There was a time of a lot of immigration. Out of the 902 people in that almshouse in 1847, about half of them weren't able to work, but half of them were working. Like we kind of alluded to, a lot of the manual labor used in building the prison was done by prisoners. So like the prison itself was built by 135 prisoners, and some of them were literally in chains while they were doing this difficult manual labor to construct this prison.
What a nightmare.
Yeah. It's awful. Much like today, the prisoners were used to do anything that the powers that be wanted them to do so that they could save money. So for actually a while until around 1855, prisoners worked at the insane asylum, doing, outdoor work, landscaping, but also indoor work like attending to patients.
What?
Which was a terrible, terrible idea.
Yeah.
I mean, the New York Lunatic Asylum is famous for just being really terrible. And you can imagine if, basically, prison slave labor is being used for a lot of the care that patients were getting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's awful.
Anything to save a buck, right?
Right? So eventually the administrators decided that maybe it wasn't a good idea to have prisoners attend to patients, so they hired, quote, responsible persons instead. One really interesting thing, so I read a bunch of articles about Blackwell's Island from the 19th century. I think maybe 86 of them, something like that I found through the New York Public Library's portals. But so many articles talk about how beautiful Blackwell's Island was and how it was almost like this paradise. And part of that was because prisoners did tons of landscaping and gardening. Here's an excerpt from Harper's Weekly from 1859 talking about that. Blackwell's Island itself will someday be a perfect garden. It is not till one realizes that convict labor costs nothing that the mystery of the elaborate cultivation and the labyrinthine fences is understood. So, basically it was this beautiful island full of landscaping because they were like, well, we got to make these prisoners work to do something.
Yeah.
Which is awful. And I also found a really interesting article in a newspaper called Liberator from 1842 that was talking about how a superintendent who had worked at the prison for 10 years, completely unprompted, just told this reporter what he really thought about it. I wanted to read an excerpt from that. It has as regular a secession as the classes in a college, said he, from the house of refuge to the penitentiary and from the penitentiary to the state prison. I remarked that coercion tended to rouse all the bad passions in man's nature, and, if long continued, hardened the whole character. I know that, said he, from my own experience. All the devil there is in me rises up when a man attempts to compel me. But what can I do? I am obliged to be very strict. When my feelings tempt me to unusual indulgence, a bad use is almost always made of it. I see that the system fails to produce the effect intended, but I cannot change the result. So I thought that was really interesting because I feel like someone could have said that now.
Yeah. Ugh. It's scary how much things haven't changed that much.
Yeah. Part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this was because the coronavirus thing got me thinking about the Smallpox Hospital and, all this history. But then it opened up this Pandora's box of all these things that were an issue in the 19th century and that are still an issue now.
Yeah.
And it made me really think about how in New York City, if we don't want to have to think about something, we put it on an island.
Yeah.
And when I say something, I mostly mean people. So for example, now there's Rikers Island, which is the terrible, infamous prison.
And didn't you say that wasn't even on the subway map until recently?
Yeah, I noticed maybe a couple years ago that they had added it onto the subway map, because it's just right north of Queens. But for years, it wasn't on the map.
That says a lot
they just wanted
about
to blot it out.
How they think of prisoners and the people there.
Yeah, exactly. There's also Hart Island, which is a potter's field. So it's a place where indigent people are buried. and that's still a potter's field that's in use now. There's North Brother Island, which was used as a sanitarium and rehab center. Now it's a bird sanctuary. So now it's sounds idyllic, but for a while, unwanted people were put there. And even if you think about now on Staten Island, you know, there's Fresh Kills landfill. Literally, they're like, what can we dump on this island? Let's dump our trash here. And Staten Island also has a history of some pretty scary institutions. So, you know, in New York, if we want to do something shady or want to get rid of some people, we just put them on an island.
That's actually not that different from Australia. Whereas, because we have like Christmas Island and stuff like that, where we put all the refugees and everything, people who come by boat.
Oh, right.
And that's just like one big disgusting prison and stuff. So it's like the same kind of thing. It's this island at the top, way at the top of the country, where we just put people that we don't want or want to think about.
Right.
And I guess Australia even started as an island where the British sent their people that they didn't want or want to think about.
That's true. Yeah. It's like a perfect, it's like a huge version of Roosevelt Island, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe less goth.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, just like a huge prison island.
Yeah. Yay, humans. We're great.
Right? And we're really good about learning from history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it kills me because there's so much in our history that, like, if we just like took the time to think about it,
yeah,
we could maybe do better things in the present. So that's some background about Roosevelt Island itself in the 19th century. I wanted to talk some about the architect who built the hospital, the Smallpox Hospital. So the Smallpox Hospital was designed by James Renwick Jr. He was kind of a kid genius from everything I've been able to find about him. This is ridiculous. He entered Columbia University at the age of 12 and studied engineering.
Holy shit.
And I was like, wow, he must be some kind of genius. You know, he graduated 3 years later. He started work as an engineer on the Erie Railroad. And then he worked on the Croton Reservoir and Croton Aqueduct. But I did find that apparently his dad was also an engineer. He also graduated from Columbia. And at one point, he was a professor at Columbia.
Oh, okay. That's not as impressive.
No.
And that is also stuff that is still being done today. So, like, it's not that surprising either.
So he worked, you know, on the Erie Railroad, Croton Aqueduct. And the Croton Aqueduct is really interesting. It supplied water to New York, to the city. It was a project that they undertook to bring water from upstate because the city water supply was terrible. In the late 1840s or early 1850s, the Croton Aqueduct actually started supplying water to Blackwell's Island, which is, you know, where the Smallpox Hospital ended up being built. They actually had to lay lead pipe down below the East River.
Oh.
And there's a lot of pretty interesting accounts of how they did that. They had to weigh it down with anchors, and it was a whole production.
Wow.
So Renwick, he didn't have any formal architecture training. You know, he was an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess he was just really interested in architecture. His first commission as an architect was Grace Church in Manhattan. That was built in 1842. It's on 10th and Broadway, and it's in English Gothic style.
Oh.
And he was 25 years old
God.
when he got that commission. I think that we've walked by Grace Church together before. It's maybe a block or two south of the Strand.
Oh, yeah.
I always point it out anytime I pass it because it's also featured in the book Age of Innocence.
Oh, right.
And anytime I have trivia about anything, I just say it over and over.
Yes.
So I've probably pointed it out to you multiple times, being like, this is the church from the Age of Innocence, a book you haven't read.
Yeah.
That is not good.
I was probably like, yes, I totally understand that reference.
Honestly, most Americans who I give that trivia to are like, I didn't read that book. Honestly, I wish I hadn't read that book. I didn't like it. But it had some interesting New York City history. I did like that about it. So Renwick, you know, Grace Church was English Gothic. Renwick in general did a ton of Gothic revival stuff, including his most famous work, which was St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Oh.
So, you know, that's the famous cathedral in Manhattan near Rockefeller Center. It's like one of the top tourist attractions in the city.
Yeah.
Like I feel like there's the Empire State Building, there's the Statue of Liberty, Central Park. I feel like St. Patrick's Cathedral is like right up there with all of those
Yeah,
others.
there's always people there, like touring and taking photos and stuff, especially on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah. He also designed a number of college buildings, including a building for City College in New York City. And he also did some buildings for Vassar, which is in New York, but upstate in Poughkeepsie, including the main building. He also designed the first chapter house of St. Anthony Hall, Delta Psi, PSI. I think that's how you say that, which was a secret fraternity that was started at Columbia.
Ooh, that's cool.
Which, yeah, that's kind of interesting. And that's something I want to dig into a little bit more.
Yeah, I
like,
love
there's so many
hearing about
weird-
secret fraternities and stuff, like little cults.
Yeah, and this was the first, like, I think it was started at Columbia, and this was the first building built dedicated to this secret society. And that building's still standing on 28th Street in Manhattan. So, story for another time, research for another time, but very interesting. He designed the Smallpox Hospital on Roosevelt Island. He also designed a much larger hospital on Roosevelt Island, which has had a bunch of different names. Let's call it Charity Hospital right now. It was many times bigger than the Smallpox Hospital and kind of has like a lot more history than the Smallpox Hospital, it turns out. But because it's no longer standing, people don't really know about it.
Yeah.
He also designed the main building of the Children's Hospital on Randall's Island. He designed the Inebriate and Lunatic Asylums on Ward's Island, which is another island in New York City. He was also the supervising architect for the Blackwell Island Light, which is the lighthouse that still stands on the north tip of the island today. So that's the lighthouse that I, in my melancholy social distancing walks, stand and look at still. And it still lights up. It's still there. And Renwick was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn.
Oh, I really want to go there.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been there in years, but I'm really excited to explore there with you as soon as we're allowed to go places and do things
again. As soon as we're
again.
allowed outside, I'm going there.
As soon as I'm allowed to do anything except for walk to the Queens waterfront and stare at Roosevelt Island, then I will go to Greenwood Cemetery and stare at 19th century tombstones.
Yes. Yes.
Can't wait.
Me too.
I really
am.
We really know how to have a good time
about that. Like, I want to take like a picnic basket and just sit in the cemetery,
like 19th century style.
Yeah, wear all black and just like goth out.
Exactly. We should bring like black parasol.
Yes, we'll rock out with our goth out. That's what we'll do.
Yeah, I'm so excited. It's nice that we have things to look forward to.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would love to do an Estes session there too.
Yes,
do some ghost hunting
definitely.
there. So that's Renwick. Let's talk about the hospital some.
Okay.
So we talked about how in the 1850s in New York, smallpox was on the rise. At the time, rich people were usually treated at home, which actually contributed to the spread of smallpox because they weren't isolated. They were just, at their homes.
Mm-hmm.
People were interacting with them. And poor people were treated in wooden shacks along the East River called dead houses.
Oh, well, that's encouraging. You being sent to a dead house.
Where are you going for your medical treatment for this deadly illness you have? Oh, just the dead house.
The dead house, of course.
I'm sure you'll get the highest standard of care there.
Definitely feel hopeful about that one. Jesus,
right?
Why? Why would you call it the dead house? Why?
I guess they just wanted to be honest.
So original. Not scary at all.
So medical professionals realized that people with smallpox and an infectious disease should be isolated to prevent the spread of the disease.
Mm-hmm.
So since Blackwell's Island was isolated, it was literally an island, it was the ideal place to keep contagious patients. So they opened the Smallpox Hospital in 1856. It was built in the Gothic revival style, out of that blue stone that was quarried on the island. It was built for $38,000, which was very cheap at the time.
Wow.
It was really beautiful on the outside. It had a crenellated roof, a grand entrance portico, had kind of strange triangle-shaped windows on the third floor. It had a huge tower on top. Of course, it was cheap to build because prison labor was used for building it. Contemporary accounts at the time, they said that the interior furnishing was excellent, but they didn't elaborate much. I have tried so hard to figure out what this hospital looked like on the inside, and I've had no luck. Beyond that, I did watch some videos of urban explorers going through the ruins on YouTube, which is really cool, and I think I highly recommend that people watch urban explorers going through the ruins of the Smallpox Hospital.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
On YouTube. It's really cool.
Has there been any ghost hunting shows go through there?
Not to my knowledge, but I could just not know about it. I would love to watch a ghost hunting show.
Me too.
That explored those ruins. In the videos I watched on YouTube, I saw some really ornate, beautiful wrought iron banisters on like a stair that was basically gone, but the banisters were very pretty. And I saw some rooms that were lined with tile that was still like clinging to the walls of this building.
Wow.
That's kind of all I've been able to figure out about what was in there, you know. There was room for 100 patients in there. It was the only hospital in New York that was dedicated to just smallpox patients. And in fact, it was the only hospital in New York that treated smallpox patients, and by law, all smallpox patients in New York City had to be taken there to be quarantined.
Wow.
So because that was the place you had to go, they admitted both paying patients and charity cases, so non-paying patients. Charity cases were put on the lower floors, and paying patients had private rooms in the upper floors. If you were able to pay, you were required to pay. You could also pay an extra $5 to $10 a week for better food. I think that's like around $150 to $300 a week in today's money.
Jeez.
So it's not nothing. You couldn't have any visitors, of course, because smallpox was infectious, but you could get letters if you were a patient there. And apparently, near the smallpox hospital, there were several much smaller hospitals. So apparently at some point there was a fever hospital, an epileptic and paralytic hospital, a scarlet fever hospital, a relapsing fever hospital. There was also apparently a typhus and ship fever hospital.
Wow.
However, most of these smaller hospitals were housed in tents.
Oh.
The two buildings that handled typhus and ship fever were housed in wooden buildings that were between the smallpox hospital and the water. Apparently, those two wooden buildings could hold 100 people, but apparently there were usually more.
Wow.
Which just sounds terrible. There's not that much space between the hospital and the river.
No,
where those
yeah.
buildings would have been.
It would have been so crowded and like just disease everywhere.
Right. So conditions in these hospitals were terrible, but there were very few other places where people with contagious diseases could go for treatment.
It'd just be like the whole island would have just been like a giant petri dish.
Yeah, it's not pretty. And medical care around the rest of the island wasn't so great either. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So in the 1850s and 60s, about 10,000 patients were treated at the Smallpox Hospital. The hospital got mixed reviews, to say the least. The Roosevelt Island Historical Society, which was a source I used, for a lot of this, they had some great details on their website, and they talked about how the New York Times at the time decried the terrible conditions in the hospital, saying that it was poorly ventilated, which killed many patients, and that it was little better than a shanty. 7 or 8 patients might be stuck in a room with only 4 beds, and infected linens and clothes were often reused without washing.
Oh.
Which is awful. However, apparently also at the time, the New York Times praised the care that patients received at the Smallpox Hospital and said that the doctors and nurses were excellent. I'm a little suspicious of that, and I really wonder if the people who wrote those articles were like friends with the people running the hospital.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's connected, right?
Because the Commission of Charities and Correction ran the hospital at first, so anyone who wanted to suck up to that, department maybe would just say nice things.
Yeah.
Or anyone who, honestly, it probably was hard reading these terrible accounts of people suffering so much. Some people probably wanted to put blinders on and just say, oh, it's probably not that bad, right?
Yeah. Another thing that really hasn't changed much over time.
Yeah. Oh, no, they're treated great. It's
Everything's
totally
fine. This is fine. Everything's fine.
Mm-hmm. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
So I did some research to try to figure out what treatments were used at the Smallpox Hospital. Here's a quote from a contemporary newspaper. In the Smallpox Hospital, there are but 3 patients, all doing well. So at the time, there were only 3 people in this hospital, which I think was shortly after it opened, but still kind of weird. The treatment pursued is fresh air, plenty of cold water, with occasionally a saline draught.
Oh.
So a drink of salt water is how I would interpret a saline draught.
Basically, not like an IV?
I mean, I don't know that IVs were a thing back then.
Yeah, I don't know either. But that's what I think of when I hear saline.
Yeah, that's what I think of too, because saline solution, but saline solution is also just some salt and water. I don't know. I found an article from 1875 that also talked some more about treatments in the hospital, and it said that basically they had to treat the symptoms, like fever, insomnia, etc. They strongly recommended that everyone got vaccinated. Here's kind of an interesting thing that I found in Harper's Weekly from 1869. The Smallpox Hospital at the southern extremity of the island is sometimes entirely vacant. Advantage was taken of such vacancy in 1867 to repair and paint the building throughout and to introduce gas for lighting from the charity hospital. Of the 209 patients under treatment that year, 15 died.
Oh.
So just like that other article I read a bit from where it was like, oh, there's only 3 patients, it kind of seems like sometimes it was empty.
Yeah.
I guess, this article is from 1869. There was a big flood of smallpox cases in the 1850s and then again in the 1870s. But maybe in between,
Yeah.
there was less.
Was it
Fewer
like
people
a
with it?
seasonal thing?
I do believe that smallpox is seasonal. I think that in places like New York, it was during the summer that smallpox was bad. And then I think that places that were warm year-round had it year-round.
Oh, wow.
Which really sucks. But yeah, I'm pretty sure in New York it was more seasonal. So in 1875, the Board of Health took over the hospital, which is great that the Board of Health, rather than the Department of Charity and Corrections, was running it. But so at that point, the hospital was about 20 years old, but it was already starting to get run down, and patients were really reluctant to go there. So they tried to rebrand it. They called it Riverside Hospital. There had been a open-air sick wagon that brought patients from, in Manhattan to the dock to go to the island. They replaced that with a closed carriage. And they also brought in the Sisters of Mercy from St. Vincent Hospital to clean up the smallpox hospital.
Oh.
So the city report after this change said, since the change in management, the hospital has been steadily gaining in popularity, and it is not at all unusual for us to be gratified with the sincere thanks of returned patients for the kindness and tender care which they received during the period of exclusion from their homes and from society.
Wow. Makes it sound like a hotel.
Yeah. So many accounts that I read of Roosevelt Island were like, it's so beautiful. It's so nice. These poor people are so lucky.
What?
Which sounds suspiciously like the welfare queen thing.
Yeah.
In
Sounds
like
fake.
the late 20th century. Sounds fake.
Yeah.
So in the late 1870s or the early 1880s, they started moving the smallpox patients to North Brother Island, which is a smaller and more isolated island off the coast of the Bronx. That's that island that I mentioned that is now a bird sanctuary. Some sources said that they did that because the patients could be more isolated there, because the population of Blackwell's Island was growing. They didn't want those people to risk infection. But some people said that maybe there were just fewer people getting smallpox. There was actually a new and improved cowpox farm in Manhattan that was providing lots of vaccines for everyone. So smallpox was less common from then on. Once they moved out the smallpox patients, around the 1880s, the Smallpox Hospital became a nurses' housing and training school that was affiliated with the much larger charity hospital, which I had mentioned briefly before, which was just north of the Smallpox Hospital, and which Renwick also designed, after an earlier version of the building had burnt down.
Oh.
So this was kind of a game changer, because at the time, it was very uncommon for patients to be treated by professional trained nurses.
Oh.
Yeah, which was news to me.
Yeah.
But until that time, the people at Charity Hospital had been treated often by, like, inmates, people at the workhouse.
So people totally unqualified to take care of them.
Unqualified, abusive. A lot of these people would hold, they would charge patients for food, charge them for things like sugar and butter, just be like horribly abusive. It was really bad. So it was really great that they opened this great nurse training program in what used to be the Smallpox Hospital. It was a 2-year program, and women between 20 and 25 years old could join, as long as they had certificates attesting to their moral character and health. I don't know how you get a certificate attesting to your moral character.
Just like good references? Is that what
I
it
guess.
means?
Maybe so. So these nurses did really basic things to help the patients at Charity Hospital, like change their sheets, take temperatures, etc., while they were, still in training. They also took classes. A few of them were called poisons and antidotes, pulse respirations, temperature, bandaging, and, my favorite, the application of leeches and subsequent treatment.
Oh, I like the poisons and antidotes one. Sounds like something out of Harry Potter.
Exactly. When I was reading it, I was like, hey, that's actually fun. So in 1903, a south wing was added to the, what had been the Smallpox Hospital. And in 1904, they added a north wing. Interestingly, when I started researching this, I was super focused on the Smallpox Hospital. I was like, I can't wait to read all about it and learn all this stuff. I've spent many hours this week going into a wormhole, and that's most of the info I can find about the Smallpox Hospital. However, I do want to talk about the Charity Hospital because it relates a lot to current events today in a way that totally shocked me.
Oh, God.
So, and like, it's just bananas how everything is connected.
Yeah.
And it kind of blew my mind a little bit. We're going to stop it there, but we'll be back next week to talk more about City Hospital and how it relates directly to some of the things that are happening nowadays and some stuff that's been in the news with all of this coronavirus stuff. Please remember to subscribe. We've got some other cool episodes coming up, including an episode about the Watcher House in New Jersey and some episodes about our recent trip to Salem, where we stayed at the famous and famously haunted Hawthorne Hotel and maybe communicated with the ghost of a squid fisherman using the Estes method. So look out for those. Please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or whatever podcatcher you use. If you enjoyed the podcast, please tell your friends about it. You can follow us on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can go to our website, BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. There you'll find our show notes, including all of the sources used for this episode. You can also email us at BuriedSecretsPodcast@gmail.com.
And you can follow me on Instagram at JenMarieWild.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week to talk some more about the Renwick Ruin.